Okay, thank you, Helen. It's a great pleasure to be here. I see it's a sort of somewhat intimidating title for this panel, Challenges for European Democracy, which sounds like a very wide-ranging thing to talk about in 20 minutes altogether. What my paper is going to center on is the Fiscal Compact. And the broad argument is this, that with the Fiscal Compact, the EU has moved from being a regime that was largely concerned with market regulation, the centre of gravity at least was that, to one that's far more engaged in redistribution. It's become a European distributive state. And as I think probably most people in this room know, the new regime is a highly wide-ranging one. You've got three broad mechanisms: the commitment to a balanced budget, or medium-term budgetary objective of a balanced budget, which is to be no worse than a structural deficit of 0.5 or 1%, actually 1% if they meet the excessive deficit requirements. The excessive deficit requirements, which are to be more strictly enforced, of 3% budgetary deficit, and more swingingly, the stronger commitment to observing a total debt of no greater than 60%, and to, with that, a reduction of 5% of the excess every year, which for some states would be very considerable. If we were to take it seriously for Greece, for example, it would be a commitment really to paying over about 6% of their GDP each year to just reducing their debt, which obviously is not very realistic. And finally, you've got the macroeconomic imbalance procedure and processes, where states are not to do anything that poses a risk to their economy, and particularly for the euro area states, anything that risks the euro area zone. And if you look at the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, in many ways it's a misnomer, because if one looks at the criteria set out by the Commission, it's largely a microeconomic imbalance procedure. They're looking at a series of microeconomic processes, and the concern is that they don't risk pose a risk to the overall macroeconomic performance. And alongside this, you have these new regimes for sanctioning these processes, and which give the Commission a greater say because of the reverse qualified majority in the Council. And finally, a series of constitutional and legal arrangements that councils have to implement, both in terms of their structural annual balance, but actually perhaps more significantly in terms of fiscal frameworks, which involve very significant reorganization of their fiscal states. Now, if you put this all together, what you have is a system of government, of economic, fiscal, and social policy that will be very wide-ranging and very institutionalized at a European level. And what I want to say is, in terms of, if you like, the democratic challenge, that there's two ways of framing it. There's a regulatory way, which I think they have moved a little bit towards. And then I point out an alternative way, which I call a European law of struggle, and it takes the point that was made by Aaron Wildavsky in 1975 when he wrote one of his first books, I think it was, on budgets. And he said, budgets, if you cannot think of any other area that is more central to political conflict than budgets, then you were better than him, because he couldn't think of a more salient area, and that was his starting point for how one should actually think about the politics of fiscal management. Now, taking the regulatory approach. The regulatory approach says that you have this collective good, sound public finances or a balanced economy. What one must be concerned is to ensure that degradation doesn't happen to this collective good. Typically, the assumption is that states can manage this reasonably well, but insofar as there are dysfunctions to the political process that have allowed this not to be the case, these must be regulated. And the rather orthodox accounts that one hears of tougher excessive deficit procedures, sanctioning states for when their budget deficit is more than 3%, rather conform to this account. And central to this account that you hear time and time again when you read the academic literature is the issue of the common pool resource problem. That academics who have been, I think, listened to very intensely by the Commission say the central problem behind public debt and budget deficits is simply one that there are more voters than beneficiaries of public finances, so voters vote for relatively limited revenue, and then what happens in the interim is the beneficiaries of public finances capture the process through lobbying, through ministries, pushing for greater expenditure, and the gap between these two things leads to the deficit. And one can argue a similar type of logic, although I haven't seen it in the economic literature, would apply to issues of macroeconomic performance. That those who are responsible for the management of things such as asset prices, or you have to think about energy dependency, can externalize some of the consequences to the wider economy. And typically when you look at this literature, you use a series of non-majoritarian controls to try and squeeze the difference. These might be stronger economic ministries, fiscal councils, stronger fiscal rules, collective agreements across longer temporal horizons, anything to try and squeeze the gap between what the beneficiaries of the expenditure want and the vote payer wants. And the fiscal compact can be analysed in those terms, and that is largely what ECOFIN is doing with the help of the setting up of independent fiscal councils at the domestic level and the series of constitutional constraints that have been put in, both as a result of the amendments to Regulation 1466 and the Stability Treaty. Now, I have a number of problems with this framework. I think it's analytically and normatively incomplete. Firstly, just from a point of, if you like, normative theory, I think you could challenge the basic premises on it. You could point out that there's an issue of majoritarian abuse at elections, that elections we typically don't take account of minorities as well as we might to, the majoritarian processes. And the way they've set it up, you could put a counter model which says there's a series of checks and balances which voters vote a little bit less taxes than they might otherwise, knowing full well that they will be minority groups that will wiggle the difference in the interim. So it's set up in an unduly too dichotomous way for my liking. However, if you just look at it as an explanation of what's taken place, firstly, it has none of the mechanisms that proper regulatory processes would have. The type of things one associates with regulation, patrols, firewalls, systems of self-audit, self-regulation, compliance pyramids, they're poorly articulated if you go through all the fiscal compact. As a regulatory regime, it's amazingly incomplete. Secondly, it's got a problem that the regulator has all kinds of perverse incentives. If you say the ultimate regulator is ECOFIN, there are all kinds of incentives for members of ECOFIN to gain, either from those who don't want to bear the financial risk of poor performance, or those that are worried this might be turned on themselves. You would not set this body up as a sort of a regulator if you were wanting this as a regulatory system. Thirdly, regulation typically has some idea of focus. Once you move on to macroeconomic performance, there is no idea of focus to this regime. How are states honestly to manage and focus on issues such as asset prices or energy dependency, which are two of arguably the most important criteria under macroeconomic performance? That if you looked at these and thought how this is to be regulated and managed, it just doesn't work. There's nothing there. And finally, and this brings me to the point where I just really disagree with the analysis that has been pointed out on this regime, regulators typically don't co-govern. The idea is they govern at a distance. Now, my view of the regime is that there is a big misunderstanding about it, which probably means that it's mine. The typical analysis is we go back to the caves because the requirements on structural annual balances and reduction of debt are so unrealistic that if they were to be met as the EU says they should be met and as would be constitutionally mandated, it would be the end of the welfare state and probably much of states' capacity to raise taxes. And that is true if one reads it literally. They're completely unrealistic for most states. However, what happens is that states don't get sanctioned for breaching these norms. And in fact, most states indicate very clearly, not least Germany, that they're not going to meet these norms anytime soon. Germany is not going to meet its norms for structural annual balance, even if one believes it, until 2020. Rather, what these norms on excessive deficit, structural annual balances, or macroeconomic performance are they are triggers. If a state violates them, so if it doesn't have a balanced budget, if it has an excessive deficit, if it has an imbalance, all that happens is that it enters, it's not all, it's a significant thing, it enters a regime of co-management of its economy with the Commission. It has to set up a stability program or correction program or whatever, and this requires us to enter into quite serious negotiations with the Commission about what goes on, and of course there is then the shadow of sanctions if the state doesn't negotiate in good faith. Now, when one looks at this regime, it is completely illegal. There are no, all bets are off if one looks at these regimes of co-management. Not just are most states in them, there are 22 states currently subject to excessive deficit. Almost all states, I think it's everyone except Luxembourg and Finland, will not have a balanced budget anytime soon. And there are 6 states, certainly, that are in trouble under macroeconomic imbalance processes, even though the Commission's prevaricated a bit in the first year. But the consequence is that this will be a normal regime. That if you look at it, no one says you will be sanctioned, there is no requirement that you be sanctioned if you don't meet the 3% requirement. All you have to do is meet the requirements that the Commission asks of you. So the Commission was very quick to let Hungary off the hook after a series of institutional reforms when it threatened the sanction period for the first time last March. Spain got off the hook, largely because of ECOFIN, as I understand it, not because it was going to meet the excessive deficits, but because there was a feeling it was performing as well as it can. And this is not a regulatory regime anymore. This is a regime of co-government, where all bets are off, and politics as normal applies in this period, except the institutional actors have changed. Have I got 10 minutes? Halfway through. Okay, halfway through. Now, I don't like this regime because I think it's analytically and normatively incomplete. And what my paper argues is for another approach. And its approach is that political conflicts are both a feature of fiscal politics and social politics, unavoidable, the central thing, elements of electoral contestation, and they have many good things. Conflict can, of course, be incredibly destructive, but most literature sees them as central to political creativity, collective identity formation, and to addressing imbalances of power. And what I argued in my paper was, first of all, a normative part of the paper, where I said what one would want if one was thinking about this is that the political system take the challenges of conflicts. What is important about conflict is that they be properly contained and properly structured. And so you need a certain constitutive principles. So you need sites where there's a monopoly of authority over matters of significant interest, where there's political mutual dependence between the parties, where they can only get what they want through dealing with the other parties, and where it's very difficult to exit from these sites, and for the power of these sites to be eroded. I say, if you do this, parties have to exercise voice through these sites. These become important sites for mobilization, and they therefore become vibrant sites of democracy. And I then set certain regulative principles. I set 3, which I just allude to: civility, respect, and enfranchisement. Civility is that parties are free to struggle as much as they want in these strikes and to argue. But civility, and this is a Machiavellian idea, is that they give reasons, they disclose their interests, and they listen to other parties. The idea of mutual respect, I say, leads to certain things such as the idea that every party be able to articulate whatever they want, and no party can dominate the political site. And enfranchisement is the idea that we live in a world that is asymmetric in terms of power relations, and the political system has to be attentive to that. Now, turning this to the fiscal compact and the EU distributive state, what I say is that because things are so indeterminate, both at the national level and at the EU, if you like, government of it in the fiscal compact, you could say this indeterminacy is a sign that they want to keep it this way, that they want a law of conflict. They realize that fiscal politics has to be about conflict. But the problem is that it is poorly structured, that they haven't given enough thought to the terms and sites of these conflicts. Now, turning to what these sites might be, I think there's a domestic one and a European one, if you see it as a new regime of co-management. The domestic one is, of course, most saliently when states formulate their budgets. Now, if it is taken seriously that the current process is because certain interests were excluded, and I think there's something in that one sees that states who have excluded certain interests from the budgetary process has led to very poor fiscal performance. This was the case of Sweden up into the mid-90s. When they've tried more inclusive processes, the fiscal performance has improved, and you can argue it's actually been more enfranchising for various groups. You have to take very seriously what interests have not been included traditionally in domestic processes. These might be future generations, they might be various marginalized groups, they might be that the process allows particular ministries or sectors to free ride on others by proposing their own budgets, not taking account of others. There's all ways of looking at it. But what you find time and time again is a growth of executive power over the parliament. This is the history of the last 50 years of budgetary politics in Europe. And so executives have been very bad at managing different interest representation and the claims of different stakeholders in the process. Now, does the EU do anything to rectify this in the fiscal compact? The answer is nothing. It asks that for the stabilization programs, these are the programs where states have to show how they're moving towards a balanced budget, that ECOFIN be notified whether the national parliament had a chance to look at these. It doesn't matter, the consequences if it didn't are non-existent, it's just something that must be notified. But more chillingly, the Commission proposals of the so-called two-pack on presentation of budgets give parliaments almost no time to consider budgets, that they actually weaken interest representation. And one has to read this quite carefully. The way it works is that budgets should be presented to the Commission by October the 15th, who will take a view on it by the end of November. States then have until December, so I assume that most of them will have some time off for Christmas, to consider and ratify the budget. National parliaments will therefore have under a month. When I looked at it very briefly, the French and German parliaments typically think they need 3 months to look at a budget. The idea is you have a tandem of national finance ministries and the Commission deciding budgets with very little possibility for involvement of other parties. This doesn't strike me as particularly democratic, or it doesn't strike me as particularly good for fiscal performance, given what we know about the common pool resource problem. That's the first problem. The second problem is the European side of governments. If the idea is that some sort of feedback loop exists between the domestic performance and EU assessment of that performance through either the European semester or ECOFIN, more general ECOFIN assessments, then you would want ECOFIN to become increasingly a site for political contestation, to be hearing representations from excluded domestic groups, to hearing representations from maybe other groups that are affected. What do you have? You have, first of all, a distinction between risk assessment and risk management. Very clearly, if you read the task force, the idea is the Commission will be risk assessor, it will have the role of the regulatory agency, with ECOFIN only departing from its assessments, quote, if they're sort of good reasons. So that is not an open playing field for genuine political contestation. Now, what has happened with that? There has been a model for that. It was the Management Committee under comitology. Because the Commission won't bear the risks, and this already happened with Spain, the Spanish question this March, of putting forward an assessment that is too politically contentious, it will negotiate behind the scenes with national finance ministry officials to get a solution that everyone can agree with, in much the way that the deliberative supranationalism worked with risk assessment under comitology, where there was reverse qualified majority. This, of course, is completely secretive. It's completely the backroom door of the trilogue. And not only is it very exclusionary, but it gives no possibility for political mobilization. Finally, there's the issue of the dialogue, the economic dialogue, which the European Parliament made more of. And the European Parliament, I know there's stuff about in COSAC looking at this and the Stability Treaty as well. The European Parliament, I think, made a big mistake here. It assumed the model was that of the regulatory state. So what it's asked for is a notice and comment procedure, that it can sort of make representations before this begins in the European semester, and maybe some idea of accountability. That is how regulators work, not how co-decision in a world of politics works. Now, if you look as a practical consequence, what this means is that if you look at the economic dialogue, not only is it very poorly formulated in terms of which actors can be involved, but it happens too early in the cycle to actually consider most of the relevant economic data. And secondly, they're excluded from looking at many important things. They're excluded from looking at stabilization programs of member states, and they're excluded from looking at assessments by ECOFIN. This, of course, might change because of the politics of the process, but it is not the politics, if you actually thought the European Parliament could exercise this power well, and there may be doubts there, of parliamentary involvement. It's the politics that one associate of a parliament looking at a regulatory agency, checking you haven't misbehaved. And that is a very different sort of approach. So I will stop there. My argument is struggle is about regulating conflicts, that we should be arguing a lot more in Europe and regulating a lot less. And that is actually inconsistent with the European tradition of fiscal politics and has served Europe quite well for 200 years.